Okay, I think we can make a start. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today on European rearmament, strategic autonomy, and the defence sector. Today, we'll be looking at the risks and opportunities that this marked shift, or is it a marked shift, in European defence procurement and defence policy. This webinar is accompanying a special report that we produced, a situation update brief report, which should have hit your inboxes yesterday. If you have not received that report but would like to, please do reach out to us at clients@sibylline.co.uk. We'd be more than happy to forward it across, but we'll be going into a little bit more detail in terms of what we discuss in that report today. So the panelists today, my name is Alexander Lord, lead Europe Eurasia analyst here at Sibylline. Today I'll be joined by the co-authors of the most recent report, Magdalena Lembowska-Young, who's our Europe analyst, and Karan Vasil, our Eurasia analyst. Just a bit of normal housekeeping before we crack on. As always, all Sibylline webinars are held under the Chatham House rule, so please do feel free to use anything you hear in this webinar, but please do not attribute to the source. That allows us to have a bit more of an open discussion. Per that, please do submit questions in the Q&A function, which should be in your Zoom toolbox, either at the top or the side of your screen. We're very keen to have all of your questions, and we'll have dedicated Q&A section towards the end. But to kick us off, Karan, I'll ask you, perhaps you could set the scene really in terms of where we are at in Europe's military situation, the rearmament, and particularly, we obviously have the shadow of the Russo-Ukrainian war, which is looming large in the minds of European decision makers in capitals and military headquarters right across the continent. Can you give us a bit of an overview of your sense of where we're at?
Absolutely, Alex, and good afternoon, everybody. So I think we can all agree that barely a week passes without a new announcement on defense spending or industrial capacity in Europe, which shows that the topic of Europe's rearmament has become a pressing issue in the debate and on the continent's agenda. So it is also becoming a defining aspect of the continent's industrial and strategic, I would say, outlook of this decade. So, as you mentioned, very rightly, Alex, the Russia-Ukrainian war in the background acts as one of the main catalysts for this debate and for Europe's growing willingness to rearm. So I think this conflict has marked a significant paradigm change. It has entered in its fifth year, and when it kicked off in 2022, and as slowly as it started to prolong, it has exposed some of the main issues within Europe's defense and security, but also in its defense industrial base, which has been shaped by, I would say, the post-Cold War paradigm of the dividends of peace. So we've seen a defense industrial base basically hollowed out by underinvestment, with leaving many countries with depleted military stockpiles and production capacity. And I think more than exposing the weaknesses, the Russia-Ukrainian war has, of course, significantly challenged Europe's assumptions, or more broadly, its industrial planning, which by reintroducing the concept of affordable mass. And I think the highly attritional nature of this conflict has proven a need for both parties, Russia and Ukraine, to increasingly deploy new elements to sustain this attritional warfare, and these new elements more or less fit to this requirement of affordable mass. So when it comes to, I think a good example for what affordable mass means is, of course, the drones. Drones have proliferated across the battlefield. Of course, drones have been utilized prior to this war, and there were examples, for instance, with the Second Nagorno-Karabakh war, with Azerbaijan's heavy reliance on Turkish drones. And prior to that, Western militaries have used them in their overseas operations. But uh, these were more for standoff strikes, and with the overall idea of limiting the risk for military personnel on the ground. But now we see that with the proliferation of short to medium range drones, these equipment clearly are here to support infantry assaults across the front line and require and have been extensively utilized by the forces with the high material loss rate. So, just to give you some figures, is that, for instance, Ukraine has been uh, uh, adopting and adjusting to this new paradigm by significantly developing its drone production capability since the start of the war, and has been able to now produce up to 10 million drones a year, including long range drones, medium range drones, but also short range first person view drones that are heavily used across the battlefield to support infantry assaults. So this is clearly a new paradigm for the for Europe, especially as countries that have had some operational experience, for example, naming France, but also UK, have not been engaged in such a high intensity conflict that is characteristic of the Russia-Ukrainian war. If we take a little bit some more distance over here, I think when it comes to Europe, there's also another pressing issue, which is, of course, its relationship with the US, especially since Donald Trump has assumed the presidential office in last year, in the start of last year. There's been a growing divide and growing tensions between Europe and the US. And this has increased uncertainty over the long-term reliability of US security guarantees, which means that this has also increased the urgency for European strategic autonomy to translate it into operational capability. So, as I said earlier, this is not just some debate. This is a pressing issue that is on the agenda of the European states, but also at the EU level. But having set the scene now, what Europe is confronted with, more or less a situation, I think there's also some room to discuss some of the lessons from the Russia-Ukrainian war. And I'll go back to the case of Ukraine, which has seen a significant expansion of its defense industrial base. Of course, one of the main reasons is the necessity to counter Russia's invasion. So the necessity of survival, which has led Ukraine to see its defense production capability estimated in 2026 at around 55 billion US dollars. This is approximately 55 times higher than what it was right prior to the war. And what it shows is that I think it shows in Ukraine's case the ability of this country with quite a limited defense industrial base, its ability to not only adapt to high intensity warfare, but also to acknowledge and adopt new technologies and innovate that are clearly emerging across the front line. We've seen that during this conflict, the cycle of adaptations and counter adaptations has been compressed. We've seen that it's a matter of weeks, often, especially in the drone field, where one party starts using a new technology and leads to the other party adjusting and using a counter adaptation tactics to counter this new technology. When it comes to drones and counter drone technology, this is obvious. But now we're also seeing, for instance, increasing usage of AI included in various of the equipment. This does not mean, by the way, that other type of equipment used in the conflict is obsolete, because there's, of course, currently a willingness sometimes to frame the debate in terms of new weapons, affordable, cheap mass weapons such as drones, and as in a position to, let's say, more exquisite weapons such as high-tech long-range missiles that could be used and developed by Western countries at this moment. Both are in use by both parties in this conflict. Instead, affordable mass equipment such as drones are generally emerged and been rapidly scaled up across the front line to also compensate for the lack of some limitations when it comes to other equipment. When it comes to, for instance, FPV drones have proliferated across the front line to compensate for some shortages when it comes to artillery shells. But this does not mean that artillery has become obsolete. Artillery still has a crucial role when it comes to inflicting casualties across the front line, along with drones. Ukraine's adaptation, and especially when it comes to defense industry, was done thanks to bottom-up, commercially driven defense architecture, where we've seen that the loop between testing equipment on the front line and then the production of this equipment and then the supply of this equipment to the front line is quite short. Of course, for the necessities of the conflict. On the other hand, Russia has a more centralized model, which in the initial stages of the conflict proved to lag behind Ukraine's innovation. Ukraine was clearly leading when it comes to innovation, but Russia has been steadily able to close that innovation gap. And currently, there's a broad consensus on that while Ukraine is able to lead on the innovation side of the war, especially on the tactical level, Russia is able to quickly emulate these innovations and adopt them and scale these new technologies or new tactics across the front line in a much quicker. And so there's clearly, we're seeing a constant race by both sides to adjust to the adversary's use of innovative tactics or technologies. But all these lessons from the Russia-Ukrainian war show that one of the main drivers for adaptation has been, of course, the necessity, the necessity to sustain a high-intensity conflict. Which, while the prospects of this conflict in the next coming years is increasing, of course, with Russia's aggressive actions when it comes to Europe, the main challenge for Europe is to go beyond just the commercial logic and adopt a more coherent approach to this conflict and adjust its defense posture and its defense industrial base to become to prepare for a high intensity conflict. And this means preparing and reshaping its defense industrial base to be able to produce affordable, cheap equipment, but also to continue and produce some of the exquisite, expensive equipment that it is leading. And this, as I said earlier, there should not be some kind of contradiction or opposition between these two aspects of the conflict. With Russia very much relying on some of its exquisite equipment, such as its ballistic missiles or hypersonic missiles, along cheaper equipment such as long-range Shahid-type drones or even FPV drones. So this is a broad overview of some of the challenges against the backdrop of the Russia-Ukrainian war. And I will pass on the floor to Magdalena to run us through some of the other aspects of this report.
Thanks very much, Karan. Yeah, absolutely. I think that really well encapsulates where we're at in the context. I think that nicely ties into what I'd like Magdalena now to talk about is we've got that context. We've understood the situation in Ukraine is influencing decision making in terms of military procurement. What actually are Europe's strategic priorities in its rearmament campaign?
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you, Karan, for setting the scene. Indeed, where European defense industries policies are leading right now are informed by lessons from Ukraine and then also in line with the ambitions for Europe to assume greater responsibility for its own security. So one part of the equation is fulfilling these capability gaps, but then also making sure that Europe is building sovereign defense industrial capacity, that it reduces critical dependencies on external suppliers, And basically, everything is going towards the direction that Europe wants to ensure that capabilities, industrial capacity, supply chains, intellectual property are retained within Europe as much as possible. I have to say also from the start that achieving strategic autonomy, as we keep discussing it, I think we should treat this as an aspirational goal. And it's not a matter of when we are going to achieve that strategic autonomy. This is a long-term ambition. We should treat it as a framework that we have to have in mind when we are looking at new project announcements, reading procurement requirements, when any new financing initiatives are announced, to see basically how are the requirements changing and in which direction the things are going. And then at the same time, of course, there are certain aspects where Europe will continue relying on the US for key strategic capabilities, as we can see here on the slide, especially in intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities. Europe simply, even if it starts investing heavily right now, it's really difficult to fulfill these gaps. So this type of reliance on the US, it's going to remain here. But any other aspects, I don't know, ammunition, missiles, drones, long-range precision strike, they're highly likely to gain momentum in the coming years in a sense of sovereign European production. So our assessment is that companies that have established manufacturing capacity in Europe, resilient supply chains, good partnerships with European governments are likely to enjoy a competitive advantage when we are talking about European rearmament ambitions and state finance or EU-level finance procurements. And we are not talking here only about opportunities for the major European defense companies, which of course by default will be involved, but this will drive demand for all sorts of inputs that are required for the defense supply chain. So advanced electronics, semiconductors, precision engineering, specialist metals, chemicals, AI software. So basically for many dual use capabilities. And Karan did mention the technological innovations. On the front, we know that modern warfare increasingly relies on rapid innovation cycles. So we expect that defense startups and innovative small, medium enterprises are going to increasingly gain prominence within these European rearmament ambitions. Next, military mobility. That is another priority. Of course, you cannot move troops or equipment if you don't have upgrades in rail networks, roads, ports, logistic hubs, I don't know, ammunition depots, all other infrastructure. So we do anticipate that European rearmament will likely drive investment in dual-use infrastructure in Europe. So this will create opportunities for companies in construction, in logistics, civil engineering, etc. And then, of course, critical national infrastructure. So subsea cables, energy networks, digital networks, etc. And I can really not stress enough how important this is from so many different aspects, because both as a prerequisite, I mean, defense production, it's a very energy intense process, and it also relies on civilian digital networks as well, especially considering the growing role of technology and AI within it, but then also how much attention there's going to be into having resilience critical national infrastructure as a deterrent itself. So making sure that even if we are not talking about conventional attack, if we are talking about hybrid attacks, making sure that basic functions can continue in cases of tension, that production will continue, governance can continue, energy system will remain operational. So basically, a lot of it will depend on how much systems can require quickly. So we do expect that there are going to be investments in hardening critical national infrastructure, but then also more requirements for operators in these sectors to participate in these investments, to participate in greater coordination with governments on military exercises, on different scenarios, etc. So this will increase compliance risks for these sectors, but then also it will improve their resilience ultimately. And this is also in line with NATO's defense investment pledge from the Hague Summit last year, when the allies agreed that defense spending is supposed to reach 5% of GDP until 2035. And we talk a lot about the 3.5% on core defense. We hear a lot about calculations, whether countries are on track or not, but we do not talk enough about the resilience element, the 1.5%. And we do expect that this is also going to gain momentum in the coming years and is something to keep an eye on.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. Yeah, it's absolutely a really interesting point that you ended on there about the 3.5 plus 1.5 allocation agreed by the NATO allies. And I think that sort of nicely segues us into the next topic I wanted to talk about, Karan, specifically around the financing of Europe's rearmament ambitions. Here in the UK, we've had a change in government, and defence spending is at the forefront of the debates that's currently going around in terms of what this new government is going to look like, considering the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister, was the former Defence Secretary who resigned just a few months ago under the issue that there's not enough money for defense. Now he is pulling the purse strings, so it's going to be an interesting time to see whether that translates into actual change from the UK perspective in terms of defense funding. But Gran, could you sort of take this wider? Where are we at in terms of the financing of all of these pretty lofty rearmament ambitions?
I think Magdalena really made some good points on the commitments, European government commitments within NATO. And I think this means that these commitments are dependent also on the socioeconomic health of the countries. That is, on the and how whether European member states are able to, some confronted with other constraints such as fiscal priorities and deteriorating government conditions, stability. Because I think there's a big difference, for instance, between Europe and the US. The US has much more, US defense firms have much wider access to private capital. And US defense firms, for instance, benefit typically from a much deeper and denser ecosystem of venture capital, private equity, and also defense-focused investors in addition to federal funding. Whereas in Europe, it is primarily government and state-funded. And as you said, Alex, I mean, if the issues are the same in the UK, but also across the channel. Take the example of France, where the debate about defense spending has been an ongoing issue over the past 15 years. Other countries are also facing financial strain, including Germany, but Germany definitely has more financial leeway to invest in its funding. But again, we're in two different, if I stick to comparison between France and Germany, we have two different military models, where France has definitely possessed the full spectrum of strategic capabilities. And it is not in a situation of reconstitution or reconstruction of its military forces, but it is confronted with the necessity of modernization, which means that this slightly lowers the cost of rearmament in many ways. whereas Germany is clearly required to invest much more for the reconstitution of its military forces due to reliance on the US for its security guarantees for past decades. So we have two different models over here, and therefore with two different set of priorities. That said, and going back to France, and as you said, also to the UK, which shares, I think, a similar military model with that of France, at least to a certain extent. There's the issue of public finances, and this makes it even more necessary to secure private funding. Historically, there's been a reluctance from European private institutional investors and banks to finance defense, but this is changing slightly. And I think the bar graph that we can see over here, it really shows that the venture capital investment in European deep tech defense and security and resilience startups has steadily increased. And we clearly see that around 2021, 2022, an uptick and a nice upward trend when it comes to this financing. So this is slightly changing, and this could possibly compensate to a certain extent the issues with state funding. But I think going beyond the financial aspect, the major issue is not money, to put it simply. I think it's also more structural when it comes to, I would say, the structure of the defense firms and how they can thrive and develop in Europe. Because one issue is that as I think, and Magdalena also discussed a little bit the procurement issue, is that there's a fragmented procurement issue. The European procurement landscape is quite fragmented. We have overlapping programs so far, which were marked by increasing competition between countries that are trying to favor their own defense industrial champions. And I think one of the most the best example here is the collapse of the Future Combat Air System, which was jointly developed by France, Germany, and Spain, where industrial agreements have led to, and differing national priorities have more or less led to the collapse of this program. Over here, I think one of the key reasons is also the lack of shared operational culture, including between the two leaders of this program, I would say France and Germany. Having discussed with military officials, they've deplored that there's a lack of understanding sometimes from the German side on, for instance, France operational culture or needs that was more or less forged with its overseas operations, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa. Whereas Germany's operational culture experience has been much more limited over the past few decades. That said, even France has to acknowledge the change of operational needs, especially against the backdrop of high intensity warfare with the Russia-Ukrainian war. So this is a major issue, and I think there's also some issues, for instance, in developing a common tank. There's been ongoing debate for the past 15 to 20 years about a Franco-German project, but over there also its failure to translate commitments into something operational project. But just to still acknowledge some of the positive side of things, we do see that recent initiatives point towards growing integration when it comes to, and growing cooperation when it comes to defense projects in Europe. And this was illustrated, for instance, by the European Sky Shield Initiative, or even the UK-led multinational long-range precision strike initiative that was recently announced at the 2026 NATO summit. And the EU is trying to take increasingly the lead when it comes to providing a framework to facilitate cooperation on these defense programs. And it is also providing financial mechanisms. There's a huge list of it, and we listed some of these programs in our report to facilitate the integration of various defense firms in cooperation. So there's definitely a growing effort and trend to improve cooperation across the bloc. But of course, I still think that competing national priorities will remain a challenge in the coming years, especially for specific equipment where various countries and various major industrial groups have invested for a long time in the research and development of this equipment. So this will persist, but we're clearly seeing some improvements in this sector.
Thank you very much, Karan. Yeah, I think you set out a number of the financial challenges there, not only just the hard cash, but also the strategic culture of procurement and the issues of overlapping procurement cycles. Magdalena, linked to that, you know, obviously there are practical considerations around the actual getting the actual kit, penning orders and signing contracts, etc. But to bring it back to what your point earlier about how this all fits into Europe's strategic autonomy ambitions, what other challenges are there? I think you were very right to remain a bit cautious in terms of how we conceive of and understand what we actually mean by strategic autonomy, because strategic autonomy in general is an illusion given that how globalized our system is. But there are areas where more strategic autonomy will be realistic, and but that will depend heavily on certain inputs, the length of the supply chain, whether we can reshore, whether we can de-risk, etc., etc. So, from your perspective, Magdalena, what other challenges are there in terms of that strategic autonomy ambition?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And we have to be realistic that the situation is not black and white. We do see a lot of opportunities in this sector, but there we have to be aware of the challenges. And many of them are simply structural industrial limitations. So scaling up production on such a scale that is required, it is a challenge itself, even if we try to do it in any other sector, let alone such a complex and specific sector such defense. So lack of production capacity, very high energy prices in Europe, specialized equipment, workforce. And talking about workforce, it's not only the number of people that will be required, but as we've established, modern warfare requires specialist knowledge and technological advancements. So you need skilled, security vetted personnel. So all of these challenges have the potential to slow down these ambitions, I would say. And we actually do see that many governments are very well aware of these challenges, and there are likely to be some initiatives, support, whether administrative, financial, certain incentives, etc., but they can be helpful only to some extent. So the main risk is for the timeline on European in rearmament. Because, yeah, the main question is Russia going to wait for us to get ready for when we are ready? There have been various intelligence assessments that by 2030, Russia will have reconstructed a significant proportion of its military force, especially if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine. So, and even before that, we are seeing constant hybrid attacks on critical infrastructure that are likely to intensify in the coming year. So obviously there are certain risks related to the pace of fulfilling these ambitions. Then another important vulnerability are defense supply chains, which are incredibly complex and globally integrated and very much interconnected. So bottlenecks can emerge several levels beyond the primary contractor. So they might not even be aware from the start where those bottlenecks might occur, or we have been taking them for granted for many years. So this makes it much more difficult to anticipate and to mitigate. And here I'm mostly talking about specialized components and raw materials that are used as inputs. And we know that China dominates critical raw materials, which even if they're mined somewhere else in the world, they're most likely to be processed and refined in China. So these vulnerabilities, of course, create risks to, I don't know, export control. So because we're not only talking about how is the situation now, we also have to think about 2 years, 3 years, 4 years from now, how the relationship with China or with other suppliers is going to be, any political changes, even in countries that are considered partner countries right now on other continents where we are sourcing some of this raw material. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration. And for example, here on the slide, we see the drone supply chain, and it's very evident by the flag that it's very much non-European dominated supply chain. And we've heard how important drones are actually to nowadays warfare. So it didn't actually come as a surprise that yesterday the US government issued an order for US defense contractors to map their critical supply chains and their dependencies. And I think this is the direction that we are likely to see in some form in Europe in the coming months or in the coming years. So, and of course, finding alternative suppliers, it's not easy. It's definitely not cheap. But I would say maybe one of the main messages that I would like to say is that we expect that firms that can pivot towards diversification of their supply chains quicker than the others are more likely to have a favorable position later along the line. Because when it comes to critical sectors such as defense, but then also energy, digital, etc., we do see this direction towards more attention to trusted supply chains. And I don't know, on EU level through Critical Raw Materials Act, the European Chips Act, but then also on national level, as well as greater coordination between the EU and the US on these trusted supply chains in critical technologies. But then at the same time, again, there is awareness within EU governments, within EU institutions about these vulnerabilities. So this is also likely to open some opportunities for investment. So funds for semiconductors, for energetics. So these are explosives, pyrotechnics, etc., that are used in defense manufacturing. Critical raw materials. We have seen that the EU has been using trade deals with, I don't know, Australia, with Japan, with other partners to pay attention how to better coordinate on access to critical raw materials and in these supply chains. So this is a trend towards which we are going, and it's good that there are these steps taken and considered to improve the resilience of supply chains, because this will be important for the next decade, if not more. But then again, even all of these steps are long-term investments. It takes time for them to basically materialize into access to sovereign supply chains. So again, supply chain risk will persist throughout the whole pathway towards this aspirational goal of strategic autonomy. And yeah, it's something that anyone that is involved in this sector needs to be aware, anticipate, and expect.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. Yeah, it's fascinating dynamics, and I think that graphic there just sort of explains in a nutshell really what the choke points are and the overwhelming reliance still on China specifically, including in that more, the innovative, relatively small scale mass which drones can provide. Even there, Europe will struggle to seriously gain sovereign capability in the short to medium term. This is definitely a wider issue across not only the defense sector but other areas as well. And we've covered critical minerals in other reports as well. And just on the choke points, I think last month we published a special report on maritime choke points around the world, and looking at those as well. All of that, of course, feeds into the defense industrial rearmament program. And given the strategic importance of that and the obvious interest that this topic and program has in Beijing and Russia and in Moscow. The weaponization of those supply chains is a real and present risk in the coming decade. So this is definitely something for us to keep an eye on and return to. Well, with that, we'll turn to the Q&A. So please do submit questions if you have them in the Q&A function. We've had one come in already. I'll ask you, Magdalena, to maybe touch on this. So as Europe prioritizes rearmament and so-called buy European defense procurement policies, what are the implications for US defense companies and broader US-Europe defense cooperation?
Yeah, I mean, from the start, the implications can be significant. Of course, we're talking about Europe moving away from its dependencies on the US. But then also, I would say the implications will be more nuanced than what we would initially anticipate looking into the dynamics, because I wouldn't treat this as a zero-sum game. It's not Europe alone or Europe depending on the US. I would say we are likely to see more expanded European defense industrial base alongside greater US cooperation. So on one hand, in any case, there is going to be more competition. So some European initiatives are most likely to favor European designed, European manufactured systems, supply chain, etc., which means that some procurement that in the past would have gone to US suppliers, now it's more likely to go to European manufacturers, especially when there are comparable capabilities already. Or innovative solutions to build these capabilities. But then at the same time, the overall defense market, it's growing. So I think that both European and US companies are likely to benefit from significantly expanded European defense budgets. So some US companies are already adapting by partnering with European companies, establishing joint ventures or investing in production in Europe or repair capacity in Europe. So basically being more integrated within the European processes. And then, of course, there are these capability gaps where the involvement of the US is indispensable. And of course, NATO interoperability, it is going to remain a priority. I mean, this is essential. There is no way around it. And even though we are talking about European transformation or investments, we still expect all of this coordination to still remain within NATO. So yes, the EU will assume greater responsibilities, as we are already seeing in industrial policy, in framing joint instruments, joint initiatives, but essentially coordination, it is still going to remain within NATO. Of course, to ensure this interoperability component, but then also, of course, there are other European non-EU partners, as well as partners like Canada, etc., that are taken into consideration in this overall planning, as we already saw at the summit in Ankara just a few days ago, and I think it was actually quite a positive one when it comes to the overall transatlantic relationship. Of course, there is room for tensions along the line, and we are tracking that. So questions of procurement requirements, export controls, etc. Question whether to prioritize ready-made options or to invest in your own. But all of these, I think there could be occasional flare-ups, but overall, I don't think that we are going towards any military decoupling in any case.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. Well, that's a timely way to end because actually, sneak preview, later this week, we will be publishing a new special report looking into this in much more detail, specifically around the potential for a transatlantic split or decoupling in the coming years. So if that's of interest and it's very much linked to this topic, please do keep an eye out in your inbox. That should be coming out later this week, and I expect we'll have a webinar on that in detail next week as well. So plenty more opportunities for us to discuss this in detail. But given that it's quarter 2, that's the end of our webinar. I'd like to thank all of you for attending and to our panelists, Magdalena and Karan, for your excellent analysis. As I've mentioned, we will be having further webinars and discussions around this topic and related issues. But if you do have any other questions, please do reach out to us, clients@sibylline.co.uk. Until the next time, thank you very much and take care.